The Maya by Dr. Michael Coe. Chapter 5, Classic Splendor, the Late Period. The great culture of the Maya lowlands during the late Classic period is one of the lost civilizations of the world, its hundreds of cities and towns often buried under what was until recently an almost unbroken canopy of tropical forest. At one time it could be said that we did not know who lived in these now decayed centers, and how the Maya realm was then governed. It was even thought that the major sites, which are often called cities, were nothing of the sort. Large masonry buildings are easy to map, but curiously enough, so are the simple huts of the common people, for the ancient Maya conveniently raised their houses on low rectangular mounds of earth and stone to avoid the summer floods. Topographic surveys of large Maya sites like Tikal and Copan in the Peten, or Zipilchautun in northern Yucatan, reveal a very amorphous pattern of structures ranging from great temple pyramids and so-called palaces, down to individual house mounds arranged around tiny plazas. These were probably family compounds. This pattern is a far cry from the neat gridiron layout of Teotihuacan in central Mexico, which conforms far more to our idea of what a city should be. An earlier generation of archaeologists considered the great sites to be nothing more than relatively empty ceremonial centers, staffed only by the putative priest rulers and their retinues, and bustling with populace only during great rituals and times of corvée labor. The intellectual tide has changed in the light of new data and new concepts. While it is true that with the exception of Caracol in Belize and the Teotihuacan-influenced Yaxchilan and Peten, there are no streets to be discerned in lowland sites during the Classic, these nevertheless function as cities, since they were the administrative and ritual centers for small states and had populations as large as many post-Roman cities of the Old World. In early, pre-industrial cities and towns of the Eastern Hemisphere, we are used to seeing city walls, but these are not found at classic Maya sites. Because of the seemingly unplanned nature of the settlement pattern, the boundaries of Maya cities are difficult to determine. Peten in the Rio Bec region is surrounded by a moat. The Batun site of Punta de Chimino is isolated on its peninsula by a deep moat, and Huashactun and Tikal are separated by a defensive earthwork. But these are exceptions to the rule. When city walls are found, as at Dos Pilas, Ek Balam, and Uxmal, they seem to date to the Terminal Classic, when Maya civilization was declining. The late Sylvanus G. Morley once classified all known Maya centers, both classic and post-classic, according to their supposed degrees of relative importance, ranging from Class 1 giants like Tikal and Copan down to Class 4 centers such as Bonampak and Acance. In 1946, he listed a total of 116 sites in the northern and central areas, but exploration since then suggests that the figure could probably be doubled. How large were the great cities in terms of size and population? Tikal and Calakmul are the largest of all classic Maya sites and have been completely mapped down to the last house mound, although in view of the difficulty of drawing boundaries around any settlement of the lowlands, it is hard to say exactly where they end. At Tikal, within a little over 6 square miles, there are about 3,000 structures, ranging from lofty temple pyramids and massive palaces to tiny household units of thatch-roofed huts. Estimates of the total Tikal population in the late Classic times vary all the way from 10,000 to 90,000 persons. If one accepted the latter figure, which some Mayanists think is the most likely, this would mean a density higher than that of an average city in modern Europe or America. Others would give a figure for Tikal and for Calakmul of about 45,000. A glance at the Tikal layout will show that this is a concentration of a basically dispersed population, with a slight increase in frequency and size of houses as one moves closer to the heart of the site itself, where the dwellings of aristocrats and bureaucrats alike would have been more splendid. These were definitely low-density cities, when compared to the densely urbanized Teotihuacan or the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan. The same somewhat colloidal appearance is typical of all other known classic centers, which in the northern Peten were always placed on low ridges so that they could be easily seen for several miles, if the trees around them were cut. They looked, in fact, rather like artificial mountains. Water was scarce in the Peten, and at huge centers like Tikal there were several artificial reservoirs of some size, surrounded by embankments, which provided sufficient water to the inhabitants over the winter dry season. Classic sites in the central area. A classic Maya center typically consists of a series of stepped platforms topped by masonry superstructures arranged around broad plazas or courtyards. In the really large sites such as Tikal, there may be a number of building complexes interconnected by causeways. Towering above all are the mighty temple pyramids built from limestone blocks over a rubble core. Although the temples themselves contain one or more corbelled and plaster-covered rooms, these are so narrow that they could only have been used on the occasion of ceremonies meant to be kept from plebeian eyes. Tall they are, but the Maya architects were not content and almost always added a further extension to the upper temple, a so-called roof comb, which along with the temple facade was highly embellished with painted stucco reliefs. The bulk of the construction at a Maya site, however, is taken up by the palaces, single-story structures built on similar principles to the temple pyramids, but on much lower platforms and containing more plastered rooms, sometimes up to several dozen in the same building. Occasionally there may be one or two, or even more, interior courtyards within the palaces. Evidence from the central Acropolis of Tikal, excavated by archaeologist Peter Harrison, along with graphically detailed scenes painted on late classic vases, shows that the palaces were the administrative centers of the city, and were in many cases built up over several centuries, as each new ruler in a dynasty added his own palace to it became a single large complex. Seated on benches backed by large cushions covered with jaguar pelts, the Aja or Calmonte dispensed justice, received tribute, entertained ambassadors, feasted, and otherwise acted royally in rooms draped with white curtains. In the great courtyards took place less private activities such as dances, ritual bloodletting from the penis and tongue on calendarly important days, and almost certainly sacrifice of high-ranking prisoners by beheading. From the ceramics we get an idea of the palace staff. All rulers would have had their own palace orchestras. Among the instruments depicted are long wooden trumpets, conch shell trumpets, standing drums, turtle carapaces beaten with antlers, rattles, and end flutes. There also seem to have been royal dancers, but the ruler himself was often shown dancing in Maya art. Serving the Aja was a host of underlings wearing headdresses resembling fancy starched napkins, and often seated in an honored position near the throne was a court dwarf. Above all, these courtiers, however, were the artists and scribes, a subject that will be treated in more detail in Chapter 9. Of course, if the rulers, their families, and the courtiers actually did live in the vaulted rooms of these masonry palaces, and not in perishable pavilions of wood and thatch, then there would have to have been royal cooks and royal kitchens, royal chocolate makers, and a vast staff of other menials with a rigid division of labor. Such staffs are known for historically documented cultures elsewhere in Mesoamerica, particularly for the Aztecs and for the Tarascans of Michoacan. In any classic center in the central area with a claim to importance, standing stelae were placed in the stucco floors of the plazas, usually fronting certain important temples, but sometimes palaces as well. At times, these stelae appear on platforms supporting temple pyramids, but the rule seems to have been that certain stelae were always associated with specific structures, for reasons which until recently were something of a mystery. Generally, a stela will have a low, round, flat-topped altar standing before it. The subject matter of the relief carvings on one or both stela faces seems always the same: a richly attired Maya ruler, generally a male, carrying peculiar emblems such as the so-called ceremonial bar or mannequin scepter, or else a similarly garbed person with a spear and shield trampling a captive underfoot. We shall examine these reliefs in the long count dates and glyphs which are inscribed on them in Chapter 9, for the story that they tell is now unfolding. The ball courts seem to have been present at many sites in the central area, but they are more frequent and better made in the southeast, at sites like Copan. These courts are of stucco-faced masonry and have sloping playing surfaces. At Copan, 3 stone markers were placed on each side, and 3 set into the floor of the court, but the exact method of scoring in the game is obscure. Toward the western part of the central area, in centers along the Usumacinta River, sweat baths are known, possibly adopted from Mexico, where such structures can still be found in many highland towns. Awe-inspiring though the great Maya cities are, there is little overt indication of any overall planning in their arrangement. Rather, the typical center seems to have grown by accretion as temples, palaces, and entire complexes were rebuilt over and over again through the centuries. There was a gradual accumulation of architectural features that seem to have had social and political functions of a special but still largely undetermined nature. Nothing could be more alien to the Maya center than the kind of grid plans seen in some of the great urban sites of Mexico, such as Teotihuacan, Copan, and Quirigua. Certainly one of the loveliest of all the classic Maya ruins is Copan, situated above a tributary of the Rio Motagua in a section of western Honduras famed for its tobacco. Stevens, who explored the site in 1839 and bought it for $50, called it a valley of romance and wonder, where the genii who attended on King Solomon seem to have been the artists. The principal temple pyramids rest on an artificial acropolis which has been partly carried away by the Copan River, but many of these structures remain intact. Among them is the temple of the hieroglyphic stairway, Temple 25, completed in the 8th century AD, with a magnificent frontal staircase, every one of whose 63 steps is embellished on the risers with an immense dynamic text of about 2,500 glyphs. This is certainly the longest one known for the Maya, but since most of it was found in extremely jumbled condition, it is far from easy to reconstruct. Most of the hieroglyphic stairway was built by Copan's unlucky 13th ruler, of whom more anon, but it was completed in the mid-8th century by the 15th ruler, Smokeshell, with a strange bilingual inscription, one part Maya and the other matching a matching text in what some local artists must have imagined to be Teotihuacan hieroglyphs. Even at this late date, a century and a half after the fall of the great Mexican city, memories of Teotihuacan remain strong. The ball court at Copan is the most perfect known for the classic Maya, with Tenon sculptures in the shape of macaw heads as its markers. But it is the wonderfully baroque qualities of its carving in the round which distinguish this site from all the others, for the Copan artists worked in a greenish volcanic tuff superior to the limestone in use among the Peten centers. Not only were doorways, jambs, and facades of the major temples ornamented with stone figures of the rain god, young maize god, and other deities, but no fewer than 63 stelae were carved and erected in early and late classic times, together with 14 altars. Many of these were placed on the north end of the site, in a broad court bounded by narrow stepped platforms from which the populace could gaze upon the spectacles involved with the Stelae cult. The 13th ruler of Copan was a man usually known as 18 Rabbit. His real name has been shown by epigraphers David Stewart to be Yaxchilan Uba Kawiil. 18 are the semblances of Kawiil, a great but ultimately unfortunate monarch who took power on July 9th, AD 695. During his reign, the Acropolis and ceremonial precinct began to take on their present form, and to him may be attributed the marvelous Temple 22, a structure symbolizing the mountain of sustenance, well known in the mythology of the later Aztecs, from which all the crops which sustain the human race, above all maize, are derived. Rising up the corners of the temple's substructure are monstrous faces representing wits, or mountains. And adorning the temple itself were numerous busts of the young maize god, sculptures which are among the finest ever produced by the classic Maya. Like all classic kings, Yaxchilan Uba Kawiil was something of an egoist, and the Great Plaza is crowded with his monuments, including Stela H, which depicts him in the jade-bedecked costume of the maize god. On the fateful day 9/15/64/16, 6 Kimi 4 Tsek, May 3rd, 738, shortly after he had dedicated the final version of the ball court, Yaxchilan Uba Kawiil was ignominiously captured and beheaded by Kak Tilu Chan Yopaat, fire-burning sky lightning god of Quirigua, a nearby city, Cibolon, which had been largely under Copan's thumb in the past centuries. This sudden downturn in Copan's fortunes, however, was short-lived, and the 14th successor, Kak Hoplach Chan Kawiil, took office the following month. This man was responsible for a remarkable building identified by archaeologist Barbara Fash as a Popalna madhouse, the council chamber of the city. On its upper facade, both front and back, are cut stone mats. Interspersed with them are 8 figures seated cross-legged over hieroglyphs that she suggests are names of places within the Copan polity. An apparent corroboration of William Fash's suggestion that the building functioned as a meeting chamber for local chiefs, a nearby midden seems to hold the remains of the banquets held within it. A word of caution, though. More recent epigraphic research implies that these carved glyphs stand not for real places, but for mythological ones. The building's function thus remains in limbo. Copan's final well-attested ruler was the 16th, Yash Pasach Chan Yopaat, first dawn sky lightning god, seemingly a weak and ineffective lord who allowed the nobility to expand in number and in power. David Stewart has found that one of these even had the temerity to style himself a Kuul Aha, Holy King. This state of affairs may explain the splendor of the suburban palace known austerely as Structure 9982, dedicated it in AD 781. Devoted to the monkey man scribes of the classic Maya, this palace may well have been inhabited by a high-ranking noble scribe and his family. Quirigua lies only 30 miles north of Copan. It is a far humbler classic center that seems, on the testimony of the inscriptions, to have been one of the latter's suzerainities, at least at certain times of its history. Recent hieroglyphic evidence suggests that it was in fact founded by Copan. Situated not far from the western bank of the Rio Motagua, in its lush lower reaches, Quirigua contains a few architectural groups of no great distinction. Its enormous sandstone stela and carved zoomorphic stones, however, are quite another. Indeed, Stelae, erected in the late 8th century, might claim to be the greatest stone monument of the New World, its shaft measuring 35 feet in height. On the front face, it is carved with the figure of a bearded ruler holding a small hand shield and a mannequin scepter in either hand, while the sides are covered with texts containing several long-count dates. The great skill of the Quirigua sculptures can be seen in the grotesque full figures which take place in the psychoglyphs and the inscriptions of several other stelae. Into the stone, zoomorphs representing crouching earth monsters or sky deities with humans seated among their snake-like coils, and in the richly embellished boulders, altars associated with them. Eventually, however, the warm turn. In AD 725, Teotihuacan Yopaat ascended the Quirigua throne and pursued a policy of rebellion against the domination of Copan. As we have seen, this culminated 16 years later with Copan's defeat and the humiliating capture and execution of its king. Tikal. It is more than likely that the ruins of Tikal, in the very heart of the Peten, were first encountered by the brave father Avendaño and his companions in 1695. Lost and starving among the swampy bajos and thorny forests of northern Guatemala, they came across a variety of old buildings, excepting some in which I recognized apartments, and though they were very high and my strength was little, I climbed up them with trouble. Tikal has now been partly restored by the University of Pennsylvania and the Guatemalan government. A giant among Maya's centers, it is one of the largest classic sites in the Maya area and one of the greatest in the New World. Particularly impressive are its 6 temple pyramids, veritable skyscrapers among buildings of their class. From the level of the plaza floor to the top of its roof comb, Temple 4, the mightiest of all, measures 229 feet in height. The core of Tikal must be its great plaza, flanked on west and east by 2 of these temple pyramids, and on the north by the Acropolis already mentioned in connection with its late Preclassic and early Classic tombs, and on the south by the central Acropolis, a palace complex. Some of the major architectural groups are connected to the Great Plaza and with each other by broad causeways, over which many splendid processions must have passed in the days of Tikal's glory. The palaces are also impressive, their plastered rooms often still retaining in their vaults the sapodilla wood spanner beams which had only been a decorative function. Tikal is not particularly noteworthy for its stone sculptures. Among the many limestone stelae lined up in the Great Plaza before the Acropolis, the best are of the early Classic period. Nonetheless, there were great artists in the service of Tikal's rulers, for the fortunately preserved wooden lintels above the doorways of the temple pyramids are covered with lovely reliefs of Maya rulers in various poses accompanied by lengthy glyphic texts. Artistry of a different sort can be seen in the remarkable offerings accompanying the splendid tomb underneath Temple 1, discovered in 1962 by Aubrey Trick of the University of Pennsylvania. In it, a very great ruler named Yaxchilan had been laid to rest with his riches, his ornaments of jade and shell, and vessels filled with food and drink, and a mighty pyramid built over his remains. But what was really unusual was a large collection of bone tubes and strips which had been delicately incised with scenes of gods and men carried out with the most extreme sophistication. According to David Stewart, some of these appeared to relate episodes of the early classic Tikal history around the time of the arrival events, see Chapter 4. The fine drawing and calligraphy displayed on these bones give us some idea of what a classic Maya codex may have looked like. None of these bark paper books have survived except in the most fragmentary form in tombs at sites like Altunha and Huachtun. There are 10 reservoirs at Tikal from which the Maya obtained their drinking water, one of which was perforce refurbished by the modern archaeologists in lieu of any other potable source. These are often surrounded by artificial earth and leaves, and contain sufficient water throughout the dry season. Some of them no doubt began as quarries, although the latter are known in many other places around the site, where outcrops and half-worked blocks of limestone still bear the marks of crudely chipped tools with which they were honed by the stone masters over 1,000 years ago. Calakmul. Tikal's great rival, and in fact mortal enemy, was Calakmul, a major city by early classic times, and even in the late Preclassic. As epigraphers Simon Martin and Nikolai Grube tell us, the golden age of Calakmul coincided with the 50-year rule of Yucatan the Great, which began in AD 636. During the century, there were many wars in the central area, during which Calakmul not only attacked Tikal, but managed to establish its hegemony over such cities as Piedras Negras, Dos Pipilas, El Peru, Cancuen, and Naranjo, to the continued detriment of Tikal, then weakened by a factional split. Disaster struck Calakmul during the reign of Yucatan and the great successor, the ferociously named Yaxchilan, Fiery Claw. In August 695, the forces of Fiery Claw attacked the army of Tikal's Yaxchilan Kawil, a battle that ended with Calakmul's defeat. An event commemorated at Tikal in a carved wooden lintel atop Temple 1. Calakmul and its kingdom, the Snake polity, were never to recover their prior prominence. Instead of intrigues among Maya kingdoms to the south, Calakmul became more oriented towards the Rio Bex cities to its north, and there is definite influence of the Oñate Rio Bex style in its late classic architecture. As it had been during the previous periods, structure 2 retained the great state temple of the kingdom, and was chosen to house the tomb of Fiery Claw, who died in about AD 700. The royal corpse had been virtually swaddled in a wrap of layers of lime, palm, and fine cotton textiles, and fitted with a Teotihuacan war god headdress in jade and shell mosaic. Among the many funerary offerings was a beautiful chocolate vase in codex style, probably created in the old Mirador Basin, from which Calakmul's earliest dynastic rulers may have come. Fiery Claw did not make his final journey alone, for he was accompanied by two other individuals, a richly ornamented young woman and an adolescent boy. Yaxchilan, Piedras Negras, and Bonampak. The many dozens of classic Maya centers scattered over the Peten and Belize, such as Huaxactun, Nacum, Naranjo, Xunantunich, Caracol, and Altuna, are witnesses to the importance of this region before its abandonment. Maya sites are as numerous along the banks of the Usumacinta and its tributaries in the southwestern part of the central area. Yaxchilan is a major center strung out along a terrace of the Usumacinta, with some of its components perched on the hills above. While its temple pyramids reached no great height, their upper facades and roof combs were beautifully ornamented with figures in stucco and stone. Yaxchilan is famous for its many stone lintels, carved in relief with scenes of conquest and ceremonial life, with which are associated dates and glyphic texts, providing clues to the rural meaning of the classic Maya inscriptions. All this must wait, however, until Chapter 9. Further downstream is Piedras Negras, which has also produced similar data. This site is more extensive than Yaxchilan and has a large number of particularly fine stelae set in place before its temples, as well as 8 sweat baths, complete with stone-milled hearths lined with potsherds, masonry benches for the bathers, and drains to carry off water used in the baths. Few discoveries in the Maya area can rank with that of Bonampak, politically important during the early Classic, but by the late Classic, an otherwise insignificant center clearly under the cultural and political dome of Yaxchilan. Bonampak, which lies not far from the Rio Lacana, a tributary of the Usumacinta system, was first stumbled across in February 1946 by 2 American adventurers who were taken there by Lacandan Indians, among whom they had been living. 3 months later, the photographer Giles Healy was led by a group of Lacanan to the same ruins, and he was the first non-Maya to gaze at the stupendous paintings which covered the walls of the 3 rooms in one of the structures. The Bonampak murals, which can be dated to shortly before AD 800 on the basis of long-count texts and stylistic considerations, were commissioned by the local ruler Yaxchilan. They obviously relate a single narrative, a story of battle and its aftermath, and a victory's celebration. Against a background of stylized jungle foliage, a skirmish takes place among magnificently arrayed Maya warriors, while musicians blow long war trumpets of wood or bark. The scene shifts to a step platform in Bonampak itself. The miserable prisoners have been stripped and are having the nails torn from their fingers. An important captive sprawls on the steps, perhaps tortured to exhaustion, and a severed head lies nearby on a bed of leaves. A naked figure, seated on the platform summit, pleads for his life to the central figure, Yaxchilan, clad in jaguarskin battle jacket and surrounded by his subordinates in gorgeous costume. Among the noble spectators is a lady in a white robe, holding a folding screen fan in one hand. Yaxchilan's principal wife. She is identified by the glyphic text as coming from Yaxchilan. One of the final ceremonies includes a group of mummers fantastically disguised as water gods, accompanied by an orchestra of rattles, drums, turtle carapaces struck with antlers, and long trumpets. Perhaps the culminating scene is the great sacrificial dance performed to the sound of trumpets by lords wearing towering headdresses of quetzal plumes. In preparation for it, white-robed Maya ladies, seated on a throne, draw blood from their tongues, and a strange pot-bellied dwarf-like figure standing on a palanquin is carried on stage. No verbal description could do justice to the beautiful colors and to the skill of the hand or hands which executed these paintings. Suffice it to say, Bonampak has thrown an entirely new light on the warlike interests of the Maya leaders, upon social organization and stratification in a Maya center, and upon the magnificence of late classic Maya culture in general, before time destroyed most of its creations. Bonampak was abandoned before the murals were finished, and the artists dispersed, as Maya civilization in the Peten went into eclipse. The Peten. A Vanderbilt University project under the direction of Arthur Demarest has investigated a particularly important group of sites, all located atop an escarpment overlooking the shallow lake Peten, south of the Rio Pasión, which forms one of the main branches of Usumacinta. These are Tamarandito, Arroyo de Piedra, Punta de Chimino, Aguateca, and Dos Pilas. The last-named city seems to have dominated the rest, and in fact to have begun putting together a large-scale state as early as the 7th century AD, when a noble lineage arrived from Tikal and established a royal dynasty. So powerful had Dos Pilas become that on December 3rd, 735, its ruler had the audacity to attack Cibal, a far larger and more ancient city located on a bluff above the Pasión. The next day, Cibal's king fell captive to Dos Pilas. Instead of being executed, he continued to live as a vassal lord under the Dos Pilas ruler. By the mid-8th century, warfare had in fact become a real problem to all the major Peten sites, and a system of defensive walls topped by wooden palisades was constructed around and within them, often with little regard for the functions that particular structures had once served. Aguateca, in spite of its placement on the edge of an escarpment with a wide view over the countryside to the east, was attacked and burned to the ground, probably at the beginning of the 9th century. For University of Arizona archaeologist Takeshi Inomata, this was a godsend, as he has found a vast quantity of artifacts in situ on the floors of houses abandoned by their occupants, a Pompeii-like situation that has enabled him to identify specialized areas, such as a house which was probably that of the chief scribe of the city. Palenque. The late Silvius Morley considered Palenque to be the most beautiful of all the Maya centers, albeit in comparison with a giant like Tikal, it is of no great size. It has now been mapped under the full direction of Edwin Barnhart of the University of Texas. The setting is incomparable. Palenque lies at the foot of a chain of low hills covered with a tall rainforest, just above the green floodplain of Usumacinta. Parrots and macaws of brilliant plumage fly at treetop level. On rainy days, the strange roar of howler monkeys can be heard near the ruins. Although it is relatively compact, it now appears that because of topographical constraints, Palenque was one of the most densely occupied of the classic Maya cities, with over 1,000 structures of various sizes. 8 streams or watercourses were extensively modified by the Maya engineers, often by means of channels and aqueducts. One of these, the Rio Otulum, is carried underneath the eastern flank of the principal complex, the palace, by a corbel-vaulted aqueduct. A veritable labyrinth, the palace is about 300 feet long and 240 feet wide, 91 by 73 meters, and consists of a series of vaulted galleries and rooms arranged about interior courtyards or patios, dominated by a unique 4-story square tower with an interior stairway. It has been suggested that the tower was used as an observatory, but it commands a wide view and could have also served as a watchtower. Arranged along the sides of the 2 patios are grotesque reliefs, almost caricatures of prisoners showing submission by the usual means, one hand raised to the opposite shoulder, and it could have been in these courts that the captured enemies of Palenque were arranged, tortured, and sacrificed. The Palenque artists excelled in stucco work, and the exteriors of the pilasters ranged along the galleries of the palace are marvelously embellished in that medium with Maya lords in relief, carrying the symbols of their authority, while lesser individuals sit cross-legged at their side. All these stuccos were once painted, and the noted Palenque authority Merle Jean Robertson has found a definite color code. For instance, the exposed skin of humans was painted red, while that of the gods was covered with blue. Of the temple periods of Palenque, there were 3 constructed on more or less the same plan, and must have served somewhat the same function. These are the temples of the Sun, the Cross, and the Foliated Cross, arranged about 3 sides of a plaza on the eastern side of the site. Each temple rests on a stepped platform with a frontal stairway. Each has a mansard roof with comb, and each has an outer and inner vaulted room. Against the back of the wall of the latter is a sanctuary, a miniature version of the larger temple. In its rear is set up a magnificent low-relief tablet carved with long hieroglyphic texts and exhibiting the same motif. 2 individual males, one taller than the other, face each other on either side of a ceremonial object. In the case of the Temple of the Sun, the most perfect of all Maya buildings, the central object is the mask of the jaguar god of the underworld, the sun in its night aspect, before the 2 crossed spears. The 2 other temples have in its place a branching world tree which bears an astonishing resemblance to the Christian cross, surmounted by a monstrous Quetzal bird. The exterior pilasters of the sanctuaries also bear stone reliefs of standing figures. The one on the right side of the cross sanctuary unusual in that it shows God El, the patron of warriors and traders, smoking a cigar. Today's archaeologists may call the inner structures of these 3 buildings sanctuaries, but epigrapher Stephen Houston has found that the Maya called them something else, bibna, meaning sweat bath. We know from modern ethnology and ethnohistoric accounts that the Mesoamerican peoples administered such baths to women before and after childbirth, and Houston's interpretation of this strange name is that it was symbolic of the birth of the god to whom each building in the cross group was dedicated. We will touch upon this Palenque triad and the inscriptions in the sanctuaries in Chapter 9. Linda Schell and David Friedel have showed us that there is a further deeper meaning to these 3 structures of the cross group. They symbolize the Maya creation itself. At the northern apex of the triangle that they form, the inscription of the Temple of the Cross records the events of the creation and the history of the Palenque dynasty, surrounding the world tree in a form of a cross. On the eastern side, the panel of the Temple of the Foliated Cross celebrates the tree of maize and the mountain of sustenance, while the Temple of the Sun on the western side was consecrated to the birth of war. Thanks to some remarkable advances in our understanding of the Palenque inscriptions, we now know why these 3 temples are so similar. The tablets in their sanctuaries all record the accession in AD 684 of the king known as Ek Balam, or snake jaguar, and the 2 flagging figures are both his portraits, but at different ages, as a 6-year-old boy and at his accession at the age of 49. From time to time over the past 60 years that excavations have been carried out at Palenque, finds have been made of fairly well-stocked tombs that were intruded into temple platforms and into the palace itself. But these are nothing compared with the remarkable discovery made in June 1952 by the Mexican archaeologist Alberto Ruz. The Temple of the Inscriptions rests on a 65-foot-high step pyramid approached by a noble frontal stairway. On the walls of its portico and central chamber are 3 panels containing a total of 620 hieroglyphs with many dates, the latest of which corresponds to AD 692. The floor of the temple itself is covered by large stone slabs, but Ruz was particularly curious about which one had a double row of holes provided with removable stone stoppers. On removing this, it was clear that he had hit upon a vaulted stairway leading down into the interior of the pyramid, but intentionally choked with rubble. In 4 field seasons, he had completely cleared the stairs, which changed direction halfway down, finally reaching a chamber on about the same level as the base of the pyramid. It too had been filled, but on its floor were encountered the skeletons of 5 or 6 young adults, probably all sacrifices. At its far end, the passage was blocked by a huge triangular slab which filled the entire vault. It was on removing this slab that Rus first looked into the great funerary crypt, a discovery rivaling that of Bonampak in importance. The chamber is 30 feet long and 23 feet high, and its floor lies underneath the frontal stairway, but below the level of the plaza, some 80 feet down from the floor of the upper temple. Around its walls stride stucco relief figures of men in very archaic costume, perhaps the 9 lords of the night of Maya theology, but it is equally possible that they were meant to be distant ancestors of the deceased. A huge rectangular stone slab, 12.5 feet long and covered with relief carvings, was found to overlie a monolithic sarcophagus within which an ancient Maya ruler had been put to rest. A treasure trove of jade accompanied the corpse. A life-size mosaic mask of jade was placed over the face. Jade and mother-of-pearl discs served him as ear spools. Several necklaces of tubular jade beads festooned the chest, and jade rings adorned his fingers. A large jade was held in each hand, and another was placed in the mouth, a practice documented for the late Yucatec Maya, for the Aztecs, and for the Chinese. 2 jade figures and 2 sensitively modeled heads in stucco were placed on the floor of the funerary chamber. Epigraphic detective work eventually revealed that the man in the funerary crypt was the mightiest of all Palenque's rulers, Kinich Janab Pakal, Great Sunflower Shield, the father of Ek Balam, now popularly known as Pakal the Great. He ascended the throne when he was 12 years old and had died in 86-83 at the venerable age of 80. It is immediately evident that this great man had the crypt built to contain his own remains. Further, that he might have had the entire temple pyramid above it raised in his own lifetime. Thus it seems that the Temple of the Inscriptions was a funerary monument with exactly the same primary function as the Egyptian pyramids. During the 1990s, a new and unexpected Palenque king burst onto the scene, Kinich Atkal Monab, who was born in AD 678 and ascended to the throne in AD 721. Following a lengthy dip in Palenque's fortunes, this ruler, a grandson of Pakal the Great, was responsible for the revitalization of the city and for the construction of major temples on a ridge extending south from the cross group. Along with the latter 3 temples, each of these were consecrated to a single god among the triad of divinities from whom the Palenque dynasty claimed descent. Akamulnab had some extraordinary artistic talent at his disposal, as witnessed by 2 of the most lovely Maya reliefs ever produced. One of these was a slab-sided bench or throne discovered by archaeologist Alfonso Morales in Temple 19, and depicts no less than 10 seated individuals in a text of 220 glyphs, telling us that this was a reenactment of the king, centering on the accession of one of the 3 founding gods in 3309 BCE. The other relief, also facing of a throne or bench, was found by INNH investigators Arnold Gonzalez Cruz and Guillermo Bernal Romero in Temple 21. At the center of the scene is the Revenant Pakal the Great, reincarnated as a legendary ruler who had supposedly reigned in 252 BC. He holds his hands in a large stingray spine for self-sacrifice. Flanking the tableau are 2 strange deities with rodent heads. To Pakal's immediate right is his grandson Akal Monab, and to his left his great-grandson Upal Kinich, the heir apparent. This young man is shown in a magnificent polychrome stucco relief on a pilaster of Temple 19, on which he strides along wearing the costume of a gigantic water bird. The discovery of Pakal's crypt in the Temple of the Inscriptions, Hasad Chan Kawi's in Tikal's Temple 1, and that of Fiery Claw in Calakmul's Temple 2, leads one to ask whether most Mayan temple pyramids might have functioned as sepulchral monuments dedicated to the worship of deceased kings. Such a conclusion is backed up by many finds in the central area, and not just at the really large sites. Altuna, for example, is a relatively small center, perhaps qualifying only as a Maya town, in northern Belize, with an antiquity reaching back into Preclassic times. It has no stela, and thus played no great role on the classic political stage, but some fairly spectacular finds have been made there by David M. Pendergast of the Royal Ontario Museum. One of these was the famous sun god's tomb, constructed in a modestly sized funerary pyramid. Before the interment of the honored deceased and adult male, virtually the entire crypt had been draped in cloth. The corpse had then been placed on a wooden platform and accompanied by the skins of jaguars or pumas, by matting and cordage, and by necklaces and pendants of jade and spondylus, thorny oyster shell. The piece de resistance was the largest carved jade ever found in Mesoamerica, a 5.9-inch high, 14.9-centimeter effigy head of the monstrous bird deity Wukubkakish, according to the Pavu epic, the son of the era preceding our own. Comalcalco and Tonina. As with Copan and the southwest Maya frontier, the cities of the far southwestern lowlands often display considerable innovation in art and architecture as compared with the more staid central Peten sites. Comacalco, for instance, out on the alluvial plains of Tabasco, is unique in the pre-conquest New World for its use of hired brick in construction, a practice that began in the 6th century. It was clearly an adaptation to a virtually stoneless environment. Many of these bricks were incised while wet, some with naive drawings of everyday scenes, others more sophisticated. By the late classic, Comacalco's brick acropolis supported a palace and reached a height of 39 meters. In buildings of the North Plaza, archaeologists found a large number of royal burials in clay urns, most with rich offerings. One of these included an inscribed stingray spine recording a penis perforation ceremony by an 8th century ruler named Ek Balam, who was then subject to Palenque. Tonina specialized in sculpture in the round to an extent not seen since the demise of the Olmec civilization. In 1991, Mexican archaeologists uncovered an extraordinary stucco relief there, in which the skeletonized death god brandishes the severed head of an important captive who was apparently Unapu, one of the hero twins of Maya mythology. This great city, in the hill country of central Chiapas, boasts an acropolis and 2 ball courts. It must have been a feared military power, for in 711 its ruler Baaknal Chaak managed to capture Kanhoy Chitam, king of the great city of Palenque and the second son of the renowned Palenque Aja, Bakal the Great. Classic sites in the northern area: Rio Bec, Chenes, and Coba. The deserted forests of southern Campeche and Quintana Roo form the wildest part of the Maya region, but scattered through them are many ruin centers which have as yet to be untouched by pick or spade. Our knowledge of these sites, as Tatiana Proskoryakov pointed out, is owed to the gum-chewing habit of our sedentary city dwellers, for it is the chicle hunters who have come across them while searching for the sapodilla trees from which the gum is extracted. Several share in an aberrant architectural style named after the large site of Rio Bec. Here, showiness rather than function is what was apparently sought, for a characteristic of this style of the late classic is the decoration of perfectly ordinary small palaces with high towers imitating the fronts of temple pyramids. These towers are solid, however, the steps being impossibly narrow and steep, and the doorway at the summit leading to nothing. It is as though the Rio Bec architects wished to imitate the great Tikal temples without going to any trouble. In the Rio Bec sites, such as Xpuil and Ormiguero, we begin to see on facades and roof combs an elaborate ornamentation that emphasizes masks that iconographically describe these temples as flower mountains. This is a concept that becomes of increasing concern to Maya architects as one moves further north into the Yucatan Peninsula. To today's functionalists, the fakery of the Rio Bec style is somewhat repellent, but no one could help but be awed by these mysterious sites crumbling in their jungle fastness. Between the Rio Bec area and the Puuc hills of Yucatan is the Chenes, a well-populated zone of northern Campeche. Like those of Rio Bec, with whom they must have been in close contact, the Chenes architects lavishly ornamented facades with sky serpents' masks and volutes, but the false towers of the former are missing. And then, as the Puuc sites to the north, the ornamentation consists of hundreds of small sculptural elements set into the buildings. One enters the front room through fantastic jaws and is faced with tiers of masks, one over the other on the corners. While the 2 sub-areas that we have been discussing are clearly intermediate in space and style between the Peten and the terminal late classic Puuc styles, there are centers in the wild eastern half of the peninsula, which are obviously direct extensions of the central Peten ideas and perhaps peoples. One of these is Coba, a name implying something like ruffled waters, a fitting epithet since it was built along a small group of shallow, reedy lakes in northern Quintana Roo. Until the middle of the century, this zone was frequented only by Maya hunters who occasionally burned incense before the Stelae scattered among its ruins. Coba is not a single site, but a whole group linked to a central complex by long, perfectly straight masonry causeways, usually called by the Maya term sacbe. There are more than 16 of these, but what the idea was behind their construction we cannot even guess. For quite often a sacbe several miles in length will reach a ruin of very paltry dimensions. Sacbe number 1 is the strangest of all, for it continues west from Coba in a generally straight direction for no less than 62 miles, finally reaching the site of Yaxchilan, some 12 miles southwest of Chichen Itza. Some have claimed that the Maya sacbe were arteries of commerce, but a purely ceremonial function is far more plausible. The buildings of Coba are in a very sorry state of preservation, but there appears to have been temple pyramids and palaces like those of the Peten. It continues to be inhabited into post-classic times, for there are few structures like those of Tulum, a very late town on the east coast of the peninsula, and there are references to Coba in the late Maya legends in which the center is associated with the sun god. Art of the Late Classic. Late Classic Maya art evolves directly out of that of the early half of the period, but excepting the demonstrably terminal classic sculpture of Bu'uk, there is very little outside influence still to be seen. Maya artists now went free to go their own way, developing a remarkably sophisticated style as introspective as that of Asia and almost as naturalistic as that of Europe and the Mediterranean. But the Maya were not always interested in three-dimensionality, although they could, when they wished to give depth to a scene, by foreshortening, and figures by backlighting. Their art is essentially a painterly one, narrative and baroque, tremendously involved with ornament and grotesques, but preserving what Proskoryakov had called order and complexity. Finally, the late classic Maya were, with their predecessors, the Olmecs, and their contemporaries, the Moche of Peru, the only American Indians interested in rendering the uniqueness of individual characters through portraiture. The Maya artists excelled in low relief carving, and that is what most Maya sculpture is, whether on stela, lintels, or panels. By the 8th century AD, they had achieved a complete mastery of this medium, posing their figures in such a manner that in place of the rigid formality prevalent in their earlier monuments, a kind of dynamic imbalance among the different parts of the composition was sought, which leads the eye restlessly along. A lintel from Kuma, a site only a few miles from Bonampak, provides a magnificent example of artistic contraposition, the goateed Maya resting on one leg and leaning forward clasping a ceremonial bar. But surely the perfection of relief carving was attained on the late classic tablets from Palenque, particularly the tablet of the Stelae, which shows Kinich Akalmo Naab seated upon the backs of two barbaric-looking captives. Naturally, over such a wide area, there were specializations, real schools of carvers at various sites. Copan, as I mentioned, had a notable development of three-dimensional sculpture, as did Tonina in the Chiapas Hills, while Palenque, at the other end of the central area, concentrated on reliefs carried out with extremely sophisticated use of carved and engraved lines. Pottery objects of late classic manufacture run the gamut from crude, mold-made figurines in the ordinary pots and pans of everyday life to real works of art. Among the latter are the fantastic incense burners common at Palenque, and in some cases, the caves of Chiapas and Tabasco, consisting of tall, hollow tubes modeled with the figures or heads of gods, particularly the jaguar god of the underworld, sometimes placed one on top of the other like Alaskan totem poles. Vertical flanges were placed on either side, and the whole painted in reds, ochres, blue, and white after firing. Haina, a small limestone island just off the coast of Campeche and separated from the mainland by a tidal inlet, is one of the most enigmatic archaeological sites in the Maya area. For some reason only known to themselves, the ancients had used it as a necropolis, and it is close enough to the Pu'uk sites inland for it to have been their rulers and nobles who were buried there. Certainly the puniness of the temples constructed on the island is not in keeping with the great number of graves or with the magnificence of the offerings found in them. It is from these that archaeologists and looters have recovered the delicate, sophisticated figurines for which Haina is famous. All objects are hollow and fitted with whistles at their backs. The faces were usually made in molds, but these and other details were embellished by the fingers of the artist. At one level of comprehension, the emphasis is upon portraiture of real persons, perhaps the occupants of the graves, haughty nobles and armed warriors, some with tattooed or sacrificed or scarified faces, beautiful young women and fat old matrons. But at another level, these might also represent deities. For example, of two common, rather Freudian motifs, one depicts a woman sheltering a grown man as though he were her child. It might well be some kind of mother goddess, while the other, an ugly old man making advances to a handsome female, must be an aged underworld divinity and his consort, the young moon goddess. Another common supernatural in Haina collections is the fat god, who seems to have been popular among the Maya of Campeche. At some point in the late classic, the lowland Maya invented a brilliant blue pigment, which can often be seen on Haina figurines, on effigy incense burners, and in the murals of Bonampak. This is the famous Maya blue, now proven through a physical and chemical analysis to have been produced by mixing indigo, a vegetable dye, with a special clay, and heating the combination. The resulting pigment is extraordinarily stable, and unlike modern blue pigments, highly resistant to the effects of light, acids, and time. Because this particular clay is found only at a place in Yucatan called Sacalum, it was probably there that the Maya artists made their extraordinary discovery. Maya blue continued to be manufactured right through the Spanish conquest, and has even been found in colonial murals in central Mexico. Maya potters achieved chromatic effects of great brilliance in their vessels by firing them at low temperatures, sacrificing durability for aesthetic effect. Late classic polychromes, generally deep bowls, cylindrical vessels, or footed dishes, are sometimes painted with the same narrative skill as the wall paintings. One vessel is a 10-inch high vase from an otherwise run-of-the-mill grave at Altar de Sacrificios in the central area. Justifiably described as a ceramic masterpiece, 6 strange figures, all of them dead or wearing the attributes of death and darkness, are painted on its exterior along with glyphs including a calendar round date corresponding to AD 754. The figure of an aged supernatural with closed eyes apparently dancing with a sinister, grossly fat snake is so well done that it suggests the employment of artists of genius in decorating pottery. This figure is now known to be a way, a subject which will be considered in more detail in Chapter 9. Vessels could also be carved when leather hard, just before firing. Some excellent vases in this style from Yucatan depicting God Gi, one of the Mayan pantheon's more enigmatic gods, seated among swirling volutes. It is natural that the Maya lavished upon jade, the most precious substance known to them, their full artistry. That these jades were traded over considerable distances is evident from the late classic Usumacinta style pieces which were tossed into the sacred cenote at Chichen Itza during the post-classic period, and some from the lowland Maya even found their way to Oaxaca and the Valley of Mexico. Most are very thin plaques with low relief carving on one face, probably executed by tubular drills of cane used with jade sand. A fine plaque from Nebach in the southern area must have been a product of a central area artist and shows a recurrent theme: a richly dressed noble seated upon a throne, leaning forward to chat with a dwarf, perhaps a court buffoon. Not only jade but marble as well was worked by the lowland Maya lapidaries, but it must have been a rare substance where objects made from it are infrequent. A fluted vase of translucent onyx marble, with incising in late classic style, is a fine example of the genre. It is somewhat doubtful whether the well-known marble vessels from the Ulua region of western Honduras are to be considered as Maya at all, but fragments from them have been found in deposits assigned to the Terminal Classic in Belize and Peten sites. That the Maya could impose their artistic conventions on any medium is apparent in the eccentric flint blades chipped to include divine faces in profile and small blades of obsidian incised with the gods of the Mayan pantheon. These were favorite objects for placing in caches under stelae, or beneath temple floors in central area sites. Along the coast of Campeche, above all at Jaena, art and carved shell reached a high level. The Maya typically painted the lily by inlaying these lovely objects with small pieces of apple green jade. It should always be borne in mind, however, that almost all Maya art that survived the vicissitudes of time is in imperishable materials. Classic murals and pictorial ceramics testified that the vast majority of it consisted not of stone, jade, and pottery, but of carved wood and woven and painted textiles. Every temple, every palace room was probably festooned with curtains and wall hangings. Virtually all of this has disappeared without a trace in the tropical environment. It is certainly that there must have been many thousands of classic Maya books written on bark paper, but not a single one has come down to us, although unsalvageable traces are occasionally found in elite graves. All of this, and more, perished in the great cataclysm described in the next chapter. This concludes Chapter 5.